17 co-sponsoring organizations who helped us with this. They are AFL-CIO Virginia, Nova Labor, Progress Virginia, People for the American Way, the National Education Association, Progressive Democrats of America Virginia, the Nova Council of Move On, Primary Matters Coalition, the NAACP, Alexandria, Arlington, and Prince William branches, the Alexandria, Arlington, Falls Church City, Manassas, and Manassas Park Democratic Committees, and the 8th Congressional District Democratic Committee. This event is entirely the result of in-kind donations and the volunteer efforts of the co-sponsors' representatives, whom I would like to take a minute to thank individually. First of all, I'd like to say there is no better partner or ally to have in any endeavor on behalf of we the people than our union friends. AFL-CIO Virginia President Doris Krause-Mays helped recruit speakers and produced our program brochures. Where's Doris? Yay. Dan Duncan, president of Nova Labor, produced our beautiful banner here. Dan, where are you? And our speaker, Kim Anderson, arranged for the National Education Association to contribute the buttons. And you will notice we have plenty of buttons out there, so please take many with you and distribute them widely. The creative art and graphics for the banner, the signs, the buttons, and the brochure were contributed by designer John Fawcett. And as you know, this is a live webcast thanks to our technology guru, Jim Southworth, and Inside Scoop Productions. A special mention and thanks must also go to Frank Anderson, Margot French, Jim Rainey, Sean Barnett, Michael Renemere, Christy Nishioki, E.J. Scott, Daniel Davis, and special thanks also to team members Stephen Hall, David McCracken, Carolyn Hours, Paul Jamison, Barry Kine, Beth Flashner, and Stephen Spitz. And finally, we are grateful to the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association for generously opening their facilities to us. It's a little hot in here, isn't it? Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about the logistics of the forum and the program order. For those of you who got into the garage tonight, you need to plan now that immediately after the program, you need to get out of the garage because they locked the building, and if you were to leave the building and try to come back in for your car, you wouldn't get it. So please, after the program, plan to leave the garage then. I wanted to tell you that our program is structured so that our distinguished panel will each first have an opportunity to offer their expert insights on the issue, and then later they will answer your questions. So please hold all of your questions and comments until during their presentations. During the Q&A, we're going to ask you to line up behind the floor mics. There's one in the beginning in the back of the center aisle. We'd like you to line up there. Also, we have the opportunity to take questions online, and if the moderator has time, he will insert a couple of those questions. Now to the program. ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, has been much in the news for many months now as the secretive actor essentially buying legislation at the state level for its corporate members. And this legislation has effectively marginalized minority voters, crippled union rights, and undermined environmental protections. We are here tonight to examine and illuminate the agenda behind all of this. And that agenda is ALEC's mission to position corporate profit and power ahead of the public interest through what amounts to purchasing the assistance of state legislators to pass laws that ALEC writes. To guide us in this quest is our forum moderator, Delegate Patrick Hope. Delegate Hope is a member of the Virginia General Assembly as the delegate from Arlington's 47th District. He serves on the House Militia and Police Committee and the House Health, Welfare, and Institutions Committee. He currently is the Director of Legislative Policy at the American College of Cardiology and adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg School of Public Health. As co-chair of the Virginia Progressive Caucus, Delegate Hope has been an outspoken critic of ALEC, saying in an April 2012 press release, "We are now learning that ALEC is a corporate front group that is the ultimate pay-to-play organization. There could be no more committed moderator for this forum, and it is my distinct privilege and honor to introduce Delegate Patrick Hope."
Thank you, Sandra, and thank you. I'm so delighted to be here, and I'm so pleased that so many of you chose to come out this evening to learn a little bit more about what we're just really starting to uncover. This really is the tip of the iceberg of the influence that ALEC has on our legislatures, not just in Virginia, but throughout the nation. And so I'm very happy that you're here tonight. My name is Patrick Hope. I am a delegate in the 47th District. My district is Arlington County, central part of Arlington. In fact, this is my district right here in Ballston area. And I'm so glad that you're here. I am also co-chair of the Virginia Progressive Caucus, and we just started to become aware during our last session really the influence and the tentacles that ALEC has in our legislature and in our laws that are being proposed and those that have been passed. And so the Virginia Progressive Caucus held a press conference in April to speak out for the first time about ALEC, and I want to read you what we discussed. We highlighted the involvement ALEC had, and we called on the General Assembly to cease using taxpayer dollars to sending lawmakers to these ALEC conferences. So this is just the tip of the iceberg. Virginians should be outraged that their hard-earned tax dollars have been spent to sending legislators to these ALEC conferences, and I'm embarrassed that we as legislators and stewards of taxpayer dollars haven't recognized this as a budget item and questions its inclusion. So we are calling on the General Assembly leaders to cease the approval of using taxpayer dollars to send legislators to ALEC conferences in the future. It's time to pull the plug on sending legislators to these conferences using Virginia's hard-earned taxpayer dollars. We have tonight an all-star cast to talk just specifically about what ALEC is doing throughout our nation. And you have on your seats a brochure describing the bios and the work experience of our panel. And I ask you to look at that. I'm just going to mention their names and their affiliation. Our first speaker tonight is former Congressman Tom Perriello, who's also the president and CEO for the Center for American Progress. We have Naomi Walker, who's the Director of State Government Relations and Deputy Director of AFL-CIO. We have Anna Scholl, who's the Executive Director of Progress Virginia. We have Diallo Brooks, who's the Director of Field Mobilization for People for the American Way. We have Kim Anderson, who's the Director for Center for Advocacy of the National Education Association. And we have Doug Klopp, who's the Deputy Director for Common Cause. And so I welcome them here tonight, and at this time I would ask Tom to come up and present his comments.
Thank you, Delegate Hope. Thank you to all the folks who helped put this together. Thank you, Doris, for giving me no choice but to come, but I was glad to do so. Not only because this is such a great group, but because this issue is so important. We all know the context here. There are those in the Supreme Court and elsewhere who have decided that we should sell our democracy to the highest bidder, that we should replace we the people with we the corporations. And the price of that has been a small one. Our democracy, our soul as a country, our clean air and clean water, basic voting rights, and even the right of a teenager who commits the crime of being black to walk down the street without facing the threat of being murdered. ALEC is an organization that has been actively behind the scenes for a long time, helping corporations launder, essentially, large amounts of money to be able to come in and provide ready-to-go legislation, conferences and boondoggles, and very loosely, or not so loosely, connected to fundraising and other things. And I just want to give you a little bit of a perspective of how this works. When I went to Congress, I had a staff of about 16 or 17 people, several of whom could work just on policy. If we were writing a piece of legislation, there are support systems within the staff to help. There are legislative writing committees. There's staff to do that. There's the Congressional Budget Office that can help run numbers on exactly how much this might cost. You can have impact statements done by experts, nonpartisan experts, all to support the impact of this legislation. What Delegate Hope and others in state legislatures around the country have is none of that. In many cases, no staff. In many cases, almost no salaries. Therefore, you're carrying a full-time job. There's not an independent set of institutions to analyze these bills. So what it means to write legislation at the state level is done in a very different way. And when you have an organization, a corporate-backed organization that is sitting there ready to hand these right-wing legislators a ready-to-go bill with ready-to-go budget analysis that's often totally made up, talking points, ways to communicate this, you have created an enormous in-kind contribution where essentially the corporations are writing the laws, handing them to people and passing them through. It's very rare that corruption in this country is traditional hard corruption where someone's handed a suitcase of cash in order to do the wrong thing, though it's been known to happen. It's a softer form of corruption that happens. It's the corruption of access. It's the corruption of ease. It's the corruption of being able to hand this over, not in the light of day. And the expense to all of us has been tremendous. While the largest amount of this legislation tends to be around public health and environment, which is often the place where these corporations get their largest return on investment, we have also seen a crass attempt to lock in political power at the expense of the democratic process. The organization that I help run now, Center for American Progress, put out a report earlier this year called Voter Suppression 101, delineating the efforts to disenfranchise voters across the country in state after state, targeting poor communities, communities of color, young people, seniors. ALEC was part of the effort, just like with Stand Your Ground, to do this. People on this panel showed unbelievable courage this year in being willing to push back against this juggernaut. At great risk, people stood up, sometimes very rudely accepted, like Anna Scholl, everybody's hero from earlier this year that got captured and sent around the web, and she may talk about that experience. To date, 29 major corporations have now withdrawn from funding ALEC, including 5 major states. It was a very simple message that a number of organizations, including some here, Color for Change, CAP, and others were part of, that said, you are saying to me that you want me to come to your store and buy your stuff while you steal my vote. It's not going to happen. And these are corporations that are very brand conscious. They did not want to pull out, though. I assure you, this was not an easy effort. These are companies that have benefited a great deal over the years from this institution and these relationships. They wanted this problem to go away. And while this has been a tremendous success, not only do we have 29 companies that have dropped out of ALEC, ALEC itself has agreed to stop doing work in the Stand Your Ground area and the voter suppression area. Lowell Fell will be the first to tell you they'll probably just find a way to do it through another organization with another name. This is an ongoing fight. We need to understand the power of ALEC, but we also need to understand when they shut one door down, which door are they opening up? Because the ultimate goal here has got to be to ensure a fair democratic process that represents we the people. It's a very simple notion. The game shouldn't be rigged. Now, we're here to talk about ALEC and not the federal, and I've got 2 minutes left, and I don't need to tell you all about just how outrageous we've seen the national money game become. I believe that the Romney campaign and its affiliates will spend over $2 billion in this election. Overwhelmingly from 3 groups of people. The biggest by far is the polluters. The second biggest are the speculators and the various people that nickel and dime the working middle class. and the third is the health insurance companies. This is not ideological giving of conservatives. This is return on investment giving. These are corporations and individuals who will get an immediate and direct return in special tax deals, tax breaks, corporate welfare, and a rollback of vital public health regulations. This is an investment. This is a purchase of the democratic process. But we aren't letting it happen. The people in this room and so many others across the country have stood up and said, ALEC may be a nice, innocent-sounding name, but it's not an innocent organization. And we are going to follow what it does. We are going to go after the corporations that are funding it. And we are going to make sure that we reclaim our democratic process. So I'm excited to be here tonight and to hear from these panelists. I'm excited to know that we can still win these battles and that people-powered politics can still trump corporate concentrated politics in this day and age, if we are tireless, if we are fierce, if we allow it to not be any other way. So thank you for having me tonight, and I look forward to the discussion and the fight ahead.
Hi, good evening. Thank you. Good evening. That's your cue. That's your cue. I just want to recognize the Virginia Labor Movement, Doris Krause-Mays and Dan Duncan, for all the work that they've done. And I'm so pleased to be here with the terrific panelists that have been really leading the charge on pushing back against ALEC and some of the right-wing groups that are really out to destroy our democracy and have been attacking working families. So for the time that I have on my remarks, I really want to focus on the way ALEC has been dealing with how they've been pushing the attacks on working families. Over the past 2 years since the right wing really took control of state legislatures during the 2010 elections, ALEC and the corporations, the corporate CEOs that sort of bought and paid for those elections, and the politicians that they were able to get elected have really launched a completely unprecedented assault on working families. We've not seen the type of coordinated attacks in recent history that we've seen over the last couple of years. When the right wing came into power in some of these legislatures at the start of 2011, we were still trying to recover from this incredible economic crisis. Unemployment was still in double digits. Working families were really struggling. And instead of focusing on trying to solve those issues or really deal with those issues, is that my gong? No. Okay, I'll know the gong. Instead of really getting in and dealing with those issues and trying to put this country back on track, ALEC and the right-wing groups that are involved with them, made the political choice that attacking working families was the way to go. They've gone after unions, they've gone after the environment, vital public services, voting rights. The list just really goes on. And ALEC and the right-wing politicians know that unions really help hold corporate power in check, and which is why they're really trying to weaken or eliminate unions. And without unions, we can't restore balance to our economy, and the attacks to the middle class are going to go unchallenged. One of the things that we've seen ALEC really fighting for around the country that has not gotten as much of attention as it should is the attempts to privatize services and essentially turn these vital public services over to their corporate contributors so that those corporate contributors can make more money. At the state level, we've seen ALEC really form the core of the attacks on working families in our communities. Thanks to the good work of groups like Center for Media and Democracy and a lot of our panelists here, we've been able to really help shine a spotlight on the work that ALEC has been doing. But I think it's really important to remember, ALEC is not new. The policies that they're pushing are not new. They've been doing this since 1973. And a lot of the fights that we saw in 2011 and 2012 are really the fruits of those labors. I want to briefly run through some of the policy positions that they've taken over the years that really just undermine working families. So, ALEC has worked a lot to eliminate important laws that help protect worker safety, health, the environment. ALEC doesn't think that employers should be required to show good cause before they fire somebody. They oppose strengthening the safety net for unemployed workers. ALEC is so extreme that they're even against living wage and minimum wages. They don't believe that the minimum wage should be raised. Who here thinks the minimum wage should be raised? $7 is too low, right? Well, ALEC is completely opposed to that, and they show up in town after town, city after city, state after state, opposing minimum wage legislation. And even though it's a federal issue, ALEC and its legislators and corporations have also been very vocally pushing the job-killing free trade deals that have led to the shipping of millions and millions of our jobs offshore. They've made no secret of their goal to eliminate unions. When you look at the model bills that ALEC has introduced, and you can find them all on alecexposed.org, when you look at the bills that they've done on commerce and jobs, fully about half of those bills are aimed at workers and their unions. So trying to undermine unions or eliminate unions, they've got a cajillion bills aimed at that, from so-called right-to-work legislation that allows cheaters to game the system at the expense of employees who play by the rules, to bills that attempt to silence the voice of working families in politics, to bills that gut retirement security and gut pensions. ALEC has been completely relentless in their attacks on workers. So at the AFL-CIO, over the past couple of years, we've been tracking over 1,500 bills at the state level that specifically go after working families. And so we're now in the process of trying to match those up against the model bills that ALEC has introduced, and we can tell so far that a big majority of these bills have roots in the ALEC legislation. But it's not just ALEC. There's also this whole network of state right-wing think tanks that work hand in hand with ALEC and the legislatures to promote these bills, put out really faulty, flawed reports attacking workers. And so I want to go quickly through, and I don't think we can, the PowerPoint, okay. Oh, here we are, sorry. So I'm just going to go quickly through, over the past couple of years, and these slides, we're going to fly through them because I've got 1:40. The right to work has been one of the big things that ALEC has been pushing over the past 2 years, and this just shows the fights in 2012, but over the past 2 years, we've seen this legislation, this ALEC legislation, introduced in 21 states. Public sector collective bargaining completely under attack from Wisconsin to Ohio to Michigan, Indiana, New Hampshire. We've seen all of these vital protections for workers undermined. Public sector dues deduction eliminated. Pensions, ALEC apparently doesn't think it's good for people to have retirement security, and there have been a ton of bills going after pensions for people, privatizations, as I've mentioned, and then attacks on workers in the building trades and construction trades on prevailing wage and project labor bills. And charter schools and vouchers, I'm going to leave for my colleague Kim to talk about.
Just leave that up.
Yeah, we'll just leave that one up there. So I just want to say there have been some notable losses, but it's not all bad news. In state after state, workers came together, mobilized, nurses, teachers, and firefighters worked together with other workers in other sectors, from truck drivers to painters to highway road people, to really fight back and mobilize against ALEC. And we're not going to stop. We're not going to give up. We've got to keep doing this. And a lot of the work that we've done to mobilize together and organize together is really going to have huge political payoffs for us. That was the gong, in the months and years to come. So thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Anna Scholl. I'm the Executive Director of Progress Virginia. We are a Virginia-based group, obviously, as our name indicates, and we are a multi-issue progressive advocacy organization. ALEC is one of the many issues that we've been pursuing for the past year. And I think, I'm going to drill down a little bit into sort of what this looks like in Virginia, what we found. But I think what's really striking is even in a state like Virginia, where we have unlimited campaign contributions, businesses can give as much as they want, and corporations in Virginia have a significant amount of political power. ALEC is still incredibly influential here. It is still worth it for corporations to buy this influence in a very under-the-table sort of way to give the appearance of grassroots credibility to the legislation that they're trying to get through the General Assembly. In January of this year, we released a fairly comprehensive report on ALEC's influence in Virginia that found some really striking things. We identified over 50 pieces of ALEC model legislation that have been introduced in the Virginia General Assembly, and found that the state had spent over $230,000 in taxpayer money sending legislators off to fancy resorts to meet with corporate lobbyists behind closed doors. In addition to that, ALEC has spent another $70,000 subsidizing what travel that the state won't. It's a pretty significant amount of money, for folks to travel places where their constituents aren't, where public advocates aren't, where nonprofit advocates aren't, to craft an agenda behind closed doors that is bad for Virginia families and bad for consumers. There are numerous bills across every issue category that have been introduced in Virginia. Basically, if somebody can make a buck off of it, then it's an issue that ALEC is promoting. It's legislation on healthcare, legislation on education, legislation on worker safety protections, legislation affecting gun rights and gun violence. It really runs the spectrum. There are a couple of the highlights that we found are, some of these bills are pretty high profile. The legislation that Ken Cuccinelli used as the basis for his suit against the Obama administration to challenge Obamacare, that piece of legislation was an ALEC model bill. Virginia was the first to pass it after ALEC put it out and said, this is so great, this is how you can fight back about healthcare reform. There have been bills coming through even still this year after our report came out that we're working to chase down. There is photo ID legislation that didn't make it onto the floor. That was copied directly from ALEC model legislation. You can put the bills side by side and see whole paragraphs that are just taken verbatim. A lot of gun bills, which also thankfully didn't make it this year, Castle Doctrine, stuff that's sort of working up to the Stand Your Ground bills that have been in the news. And one of the ALEC bills that did pass this year is essentially a faux voucher scheme for corporations and individuals to get tax credits for spending money to send kids to private schools and taking money out of the public coffers, out of public schools to send kids off for private, in a lot of cases, religious education. One of the reasons that we think that ALEC is so influential in Virginia is, quite frankly, because of the Speaker of the House of Delegates. Bill Howell is a former national chair of ALEC, and he still sits on their national board. And he, as Delegate Hope can tell you, is a pretty powerful person. He has pretty universal power within the House of Delegates to determine committee assignments, to make decisions, to make or break legislation. He pushes this organization. He is the person who signs off on the use of taxpayer funds for members of the House of Delegates to go off to these conferences. From our public records requests so far this year, it looks like there are 13 members of the General Assembly that are going to be heading off to Salt Lake City in a couple of weeks for the next ALEC conference. So it's not only the use of money, but Speaker Howell has been known to push pieces of ALEC legislation that he really wants passed to get his members to carry them. There was a particular bill that would eradicate asbestos liability for a single company that he pushed his colleagues to carry. When the bill didn't pass, he unilaterally reassigned committees to get it to pass. And several delegates have said that the Speaker has pushed them to carry legislation. The other reason really that ALEC has a very strong foothold in Virginia really goes back to what Tom alluded to a minute ago, is that the General Assembly in Virginia has part-time legislators who have at most one legislative aide, And we have a very short General Assembly session. They're there for 6 weeks, for 8 weeks, for 10 weeks, and there's a lot to get done. There are thousands of bills coming through, and I'm sure Delegate Hope can tell you a lot of times it's, frequently all the time that they have in the day to track the bills that they put in, that they're trying to get passed, and keep on top of what's coming up in their committee. There simply isn't time among the professional staff to review every bill, to figure out where it came from, track down who it's benefiting, which means that folks like Speaker Howell, who are telling his caucus how to vote and understand what's going on behind the scenes, wield incredible power to get these bills introduced and get them passed. As I said before, it really, ALEC provides to corporations like Altria, like Dominion, the ability to give this appearance of grassroots support for legislation that does nothing more than increase their profits. You can find our report that has a lot more information about the legislation that we found online on our website. It's progressva.org/ALEC. The other thing that we've been working on in terms of advocacy is identifying the Virginia legislators who are members of ALEC. In our original report, we found 115 current and former legislators who have ties to the organization. Either they were members, they've traveled to a conference, they have sponsored or co-sponsored ALEC legislation. Sometimes, frankly, they've co-sponsored ALEC legislation without their knowledge, because someone who's an ALEC member took it to them and said, hey, I have this really great bill, don't you want to sign on to it with me? And didn't disclose where that legislation came from. We've been asking legislators to proactively disclose if they are members of ALEC, because those membership rolls are not open to the public. ALEC is not a transparent organization, no matter what its members will tell you. Their conferences are closed to the public. The only reason we have pieces of their model legislation is because they were leaked by a whistleblower, and the Center for Media and Democracy has made them available for the masses to see. Thus far, we have 53 Virginia legislators, including Delegate Hope, who have testified that they are not members of ALEC and won't be pursuing membership anytime soon. But hopefully, we're going to keep on them. But the folks who are members of ALEC get pretty ruffled about being challenged on it. It's an agenda that obviously the corporations who are supporting ALEC would prefer to keep in the dark. As you can see, the more light we shine on this, the more people run away, and that's what we're working to do in Virginia with the legislators who are pushing this agenda here.
So how's everybody doing this evening? All right. Doing well? All right. First of all, I'd like to say I'm actually very excited when I come out to these events on like a Thursday night after folks have been at work or been doing whatever they've been doing, and it's like been doing a million other things. So it's very encouraging to see a crowd like this around a conversation like this, because I think it's very important. And it's really important because this also shows a contrast to what ALEC does. ALEC doesn't fill a room with regular citizens that are concerned about the issues that impact their lives every day. They fill the room with corporations that just have monetary interest in moving public policy that benefits their bottom line. So I think the public advocacy around this is one of the most important pieces that we have to highlight. We've heard a lot of great points from my colleagues here on the panel, and a lot of us have been working together for a long time against ALEC, doing what's necessary to push back, call out ALEC, make ALEC something that's toxic now to be a member of or be a part of, making the public a little bit more aware about who ALEC is and who's behind ALEC. I know many of you have heard of the Koch brothers, right? You have folks like that are behind ALEC because they have their own special interests that they're trying to push. I mean, they like to call unions and those of us that actually represent people as special interests. But really, you look at those corporations that basically are just moving legislation to increase their profits, no matter what obstacles stand in their way, how that impacts people. They don't care. Their bottom line is to increase their bottom line, right? That's what they want to do. So one of the things I want to talk about a little bit from the perspective of the People for the American Way is also how do you all get involved in this fight? One of the things that's really important is that average everyday citizens need to be engaged in the conversations around ALEC. You need to be talking to your friends and your neighbors. Do you know about ALEC? Do you know about the state legislators in our state house that are involved with ALEC? Did you know what they're doing? Do you know that the state legislature paid for them to go to Tampa, Florida, or some cool resort in Arizona, or going out to Salt Lake City in a cool hotel and resort on our dime? Did you know that's happening? You know they're passing legislation to keep you from voting. Those of us the folks that don't have voter IDs, they're passing all these voter ID legislations across the country. You have to educate your community about these issues and who's behind them, and empower our communities to be able to fight back against ALEC. The other thing is call into your newspapers. You know, call into your state legislative offices. Call into state legislative offices in your state that are not your state legislator, and let them know, are you a member of ALEC? What did you get at the ALEC conference? I heard that you went to the ALEC conference coming up in 2 weeks. You know, and those are the types of things that we need to do as advocates. We also need to reach beyond our borders, beyond our own states, beyond Virginia, because this has a national impact. Folks all over the country are impacted by what's happening with ALEC. We saw what happened in Wisconsin and Michigan and others with the anti-union laws. This stuff did not, and Naomi mentioned it, it didn't happen yesterday. They didn't just form this group yesterday and then all of a sudden get a bunch of legislators and say, okay, we're going to roll this out quickly and this is going to happen. They started in the 70s with this. They built an infrastructure for a very long time. And when those legislatures looked very different from the way they look now, they were introducing bills every single year. And those of us that work with state legislators know that that process takes a while sometimes. You know, you introduce a bill, you get a couple other sponsors, you get new people elected to office that come in and go into some of these trips with you. You give them some of that model legislation. They feel good because they can actually drop a bill that they think is going to, you know, help their status. And then that stuff starts to accumulate. And if we don't push back, if we don't call that out, there's several organizations that are working on the state level that know what the ALEC bills are. They can tell you. They can set an ALEC agenda for you. Hey, when you go to talk to your state legislator about XYZ that's in your community, talk to them about ALEC. Talk to them about their engagement in ALEC. It's really the activism that we have as a community to push back that's going to change the tide. All of us got involved in this campaign to push on corporations to pull out of ALEC. And from that push, from making it so toxic to be a part of ALEC, we had that 29 the 29 corporations that pulled out of ALEC because it kind of looked bad for them when they're trying to sell product in certain communities, and they say, hey, you know, they supported the Stand Your Ground law. They support suppressing your vote. They don't want to have voter registration drives. They don't want to have voter education, voter mobilization in your communities. They want to make sure that you have an ID. In states like Texas, they want you to have, you can use a gun license, but you can't use a college ID to register to vote. I mean, these are the things they're passing because what they want, the fewer of you that are able to participate in our democracy, the fewer of your neighbors that are able to participate in our democracy, the better it is and easier it is for them to move their legislation. So they have a dual agenda. There's this corporate agenda, let's take out the folks that have powers. They want to undermine unions because that's a power structure that stands in their way, right? And then they want to undermine voting because that's a power structure that stands in their way. Because the only thing that stands up against dollars is people. And the less people that they can, the more people that they can get out of the democratic process, the better it is for them. The more single-minded folks that they have can actually move legislation in the state legislature. So we need folks to call into radio stations and talk about ALEC. We need the people to write op-eds, letters to the editor, call into their newspapers, and then actually, like I said, put pressure on the state legislators themselves. Right? A lot of them, like they said, don't have the staff capacity to do legislation, so some of them are looking for easy way out. Right? Some of them are looking for that easy piece that they can put out, put their name on, sign on. And actually, to be honest, there's a couple of them, not a whole lot, that don't know what they're doing. They can get a free trip, go out to some place, they're a newly elected legislator. I mean, even some folks on the other side of the aisle, you know, they get caught up in that and they say it's easy to do. Put pressure on them. Let them know that there's people watching them every single day. And that's our mission. That's our mission, is to come together, and a lot of us have done that. I've been working against ALEC for the last 15 plus years against ALEC. I'm working with state legislators, progressive state legislators, to push back against ALEC for years. And so it's exciting now to see that there actually is some energy. So I want you to leave here feeling like there is actually some momentum, because those of us that have been working on this for a long time, ALEC was a machine just kind of rolling stuff out. Nobody heard about it. Nobody cared about it. And now people care. You got corporations that are like, oh, I don't know if I, really want to be affiliated with this organization. But the other thing is, I want to put another point on this. As we push corporations out, we need to continue to watch those corporations and make sure that they do the right thing. Because what will happen is they'll step back for a couple of years, a year or two, wait till things die down, and all of a sudden they'll start writing checks again, or writing checks to another entity. So we have to make sure we continue to put pressure on these institutions, whoever they may be. They can be called ALEC now, called something else later. Connect the dots and go after them, because it's our boots on the ground that's going to push back against these billions and billions of dollars that are trying to pollute and corrupt our political structure. And with that, I'll yield 19 seconds to questions and answers later.
Well done, Diallo. Good evening. This is like a homecoming for me. I cut my teeth in Northern Virginia Democratic politics here and in my neighboring jurisdiction of Alexandria, so it's nice to see old friends. And thank you, Sandra, for pulling us all together. I want to talk specifically about the education component in ALEC. It's a little bit confusing, so let me walk through. The basics of the ALEC agenda are as follows. If you get quote-unquote government out of the way and you privatize everything, you create a market for corporations to make profit, right? You also need, in order to do that though, to eliminate organized labor, right? So we've seen, and we talked about all of the attacks on collective bargaining, the various attempts to gut organized labor as a force that competes with corporate entities, essentially, for mobilization of people, lobbying state capitals, lobbying municipal governments, etc. If you get labor out of the way, well, there's an unfettered path for corporations to have a virtually unregulated market to do whatever they want. And a third pillar that has appeared in ALEC's agenda over the last 10 years or so, and really ratcheted up with the advent of the Citizens United decision. How many people are familiar with Citizens United? Okay, just checking. Good. Back in my home with an educated populace. Thank you, Arlington. With the advent of Citizens United, obviously it makes easier for corporations to have unfettered access to the reins of government. And so one of the things that has happened, if you look at some of the handouts that I brought together with me, there's a great article done by Lee Fang of The Nation, and then a more recent article actually in the Washington Post about the architecture around companies looking at public education, the institution of public education, whose birthplace arguably was here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, led by Thomas Jefferson and many others. Public education as an institution is looked at as an industry for profit. There is a very, very concerted effort, well organized, by a cabal of folks to buy off pieces of our public education system. In Rupert Murdoch's words, it is a $555 billion enterprise waiting for us to seize it so we can make profit. In the article, check it out. So we have some choices that we need to make as a society, but more importantly, we as advocates and as progressives, I dare presume, to protect the institution of public education. It is free. It is accessible to everybody. It is founded on the principle that everybody needs to be educated. And so, if it is sold off to the highest bidder, with no regard to quality, no regard to those who are giving instruction at the head of our classrooms, or those who are driving buses, or those who are providing food in cafeterias, without regard to any quality, what happens to kids? What happens to the fabric of our democracy when we have a less educated citizenry? Well, these companies don't care. Excuse my French, they don't give a shit. They really don't. They're about making money. And they don't see the faces of the kids who walk into our schools every day, who walk in hungry, right? Whose parents have just been laid off because of the economy. They don't see those kids, but we do. Our members do. And so do you out in the community. So what we have, and with the work of lots of other groups, and Doug is going to talk a lot more about this, and I see my colleague Aniello Ioto in the back, yay, Aniello, and others, is really engaged in a concerted pushback on ALEC to raise the awareness of who they are, expose their infrastructure, as well as alert folks and hold people accountable. Are you introducing an ALEC bill? Are you a member of ALEC? You know, for those of you who sit on, I know this is a nonpartisan event, but for those of you who are interested in screening candidates, for example, whatever side of the aisle you're on, be an interesting question. Are you a member of ALEC? Have you ever introduced an ALEC-sponsored bill? That will give you some idea of where they stand on issues and whether or not they actually care about public institutions being accessible for everybody. Doug will also talk about this as a huge shot in the arm for anybody who cares about progressive policies and a progressive society and a more just society. And again, Doug will talk about these companies. So here's a quote from the National NEA Vice President, Lily Eskelsen, who's a total riot if you've not seen her. She's just phenomenal. She presented recently at Netroots Nation, which is a great presentation and grouping of bloggers, etc. Their arithmetic is very simple. Deregulate, defund, privatize, then profit, right? That's what they're after. So for those of you who want to know how these show up in an education context, I have a handout here, ALEC legislation agenda on, or legislative agenda on education. It shows up in the form of tuition tax credits. It shows up in the form of vouchers. It shows up in the form of education management organizations that take over charter schools but have no accountability whatsoever to taxpayers. No responsibility to report expenditures, etc. It shows up in the form of virtual education. Now, before you assail me, virtual education shows great promise if it's done correctly. Innovation in our schools is absolutely necessary to equip students with the skills they need for the 21st century economy. However, just in Virginia, there is an instance of very insidious corporate-driven behavior, and that is that in many states have education funding formulas for general aid. Delegate Hope can speak to this probably directly, that do the right thing in that they fund school districts and shove more money to poorer school districts to try to compensate for what students need. So poorer school districts actually get more general aid from the state so that students who have needs, whether they be poverty, whether it's a need for after-school care, whether it's a needs of their parents, their communities, etc., they get more assistance. These virtual online companies are locating in these districts on purpose to capture higher per pupil amounts of expenditures, despite the fact that they have no walls, no buildings to fund, no after-school programs, no athletics, etc. They have none of the overhead costs of normal public school settings, and yet they're capturing from the public trough higher per pupil amounts because they're strategic. I would call it insidious. These folks are bad folks, and we have a responsibility to our community, and we have a responsibility to our children to challenge them, to speak up, to ask questions, and to be tough. Because anybody who comes to you and says, we have a great new innovative idea, stop and question it. Stop and question it, because I guarantee you they're not interested in equity, and they're not interested in equal access for every kid in America. They're not interested in that. So speak up, speak out, keep mobilizing, and I will turn it over to Doug, who's going to wrap it up.
Good evening. My name is Doug Klopp, and I serve as the Deputy Director for Program for Common Cause here in Washington, D.C. I just want to reiterate just a thank you to all of you for coming out here on a Thursday night and taking your time. But this is important stuff. How many people a year ago had ever heard of the American Legislative Exchange Council? That's pretty impressive. And tonight, all of you have. In 1 year, almost a year ago to the day, the Center for Media and Democracy, through its alecexposed.org website, published for the first time in 40 years the entire ALEC corporate library for the public to see. For many of us, like Diallo and I, who had been fighting this agenda for years at the state legislative level, it was an epiphany. I come from Maine, and I could never figure out on the third floor of the Maine State Legislature how a freshman legislator from rural Maine who owned a variety store could drop a 74-page bill completely dovetailed to Maine statute that could deregulate Maine's utility industry and hand it over to corporate for 50 cents on the dollar. I could never figure out how, again, in a citizens legislature, and Patrick has talked about this, that has really limited staff, that we could see bills to eliminate collective bargaining, how we could see bills to sever consumer rights to the courts for corporate products that kill or poison. And so finally I went over to one of my Republican, conservative, corporate lobbyists and I said, hey, where does this stuff come from? And he said, well, Doug, it comes from ALEC. It's an ALEC bill, right? And I said, well, what's that? He said, well, it's the American Legislative Exchange Council, and it's bigger than you realize, right? So I started researching them, and you finally could actually, when we got the internet, right, we could go on the inner tubes and find the ALEC website, and you could look at it, and you could even get the names of some of these bills, but what you could never, ever, ever do was access them. You could never see what these bills are about. But that changed last July. And when this went live, it was really a game changer for many of us. When we first saw the breadth and scope of what these bills meant, we were shocked. Because these bills touch almost every aspect of American life. If you are a powerful corporation, ALEC is the infrastructure that you want to play ball in. You heard earlier that ALEC really does represent the epitome of a pay-to-play system. These corporations for over 40 years have bought their way onto ALEC. Once you become a corporate member, you know what you can do then? You can buy your way onto a task force of your choosing. You could even buy your way all the way up to be a task force chair. Imagine that. And what ALEC guaranteed up until a year ago was that you could do it in absolute secrecy. So to understand ALEC, or understand the scope of what we're talking about, is to understand that over 200 of America's most powerful corporations comprise ALEC. Even before the 2010 midterm, over 2,000 state legislators, elected officials, are ALEC members. That's almost 1/3 of all elected officials in this country. And the way it works is that those elected officials pay $50 a year to be a member. But then they can get on a plane, courtesy of a scholarship fund, usually raised by corporate interests in state, and you are flown to a gated community, like Scottsdale, Arizona, for 4 days, where you are locked in at a task force level with these corporations and these corporate lobbyists. And here's the thing. You sit on these task forces, and you are an equal member. So we've got task forces with corporate lobbyists and legislators voting as equal on model legislation to be moved in to this library. I look sometimes in horror in Maine recently as I look back, I've been here for about 2 years, that some of these bills are being dropped in the Maine state legislature, some of them without a public hearing, or even an adequate notice for the public to come. Sometimes these bills don't even get an amendment before they sail to the House floor, onto the Senate, and onto Governor LePage's desk. Many times, like I said, without even an amendment. You know why? Because it's already been pre-voted. It's already been pre-voted at some of these ALEC retreats, like the one that's coming up in Utah that we're going to be at. And if you think about that, you know, that means that we have almost taken a big chunk of our democracy and we have moved it behind a closed door controlled by some of America's most powerful corporations. All right? But here's the good news. Louis Brandeis said that the best disinfectant is sunshine. And since last July to this day, we have been shining a light on ALEC that is very, very, very bright. It is so bright that over 25 of America's most powerful corporations have left ALEC. Okay, these are corporate titans. They are McDonald's. They are Kraft Foods. Believe it or not, Walmart. I almost fell out of my chair when that came across my desk. Walmart, really? It's too extreme for Walmart. All right. I didn't think I'd ever see the day, but it has come. All right. Just this week, 5 more major corporations have announced that they will no longer be associated with the American Legislative Exchange Council. All right. What ALEC represents for us in the progressive community, if you're a government reform, democracy advocacy group like Common Cause, or you are labor, or you are the environmental community, it offers a unique opportunity to bring us all together. It is a powerful tool that we can work in the states that can galvanize everybody against this onslaught of a corporate control of our democracy exacerbated by Citizens United, right? We are living in a very, very dangerous time. But we have the power to fight back. At the end of the day, for all of these groups, Common Cause, PFAS, Center for Media and Democracy, Progress Now, all of us, NEA, AFL, is that this is an accountability campaign. We need to hold not only these corporations accountable for their role in this, but we need to hold the legislators accountable for their role in this, right? We have that ability now, and I've only got 52 seconds left, and maybe when we get to the question and answer, we can put a couple of resources up here on the screen for you all, so that you can actually come out of this tonight and be able to have some real tools for you to hold your Virginia delegates accountable. All right? Here's the kicker with ALEC. For 40 years, they have maintained that they are a tax-exempt charity. Okay? A 501c3, just like the Soup Kitchen, the Boys and Girls Club, and the church I passed across the street. So what that means is that these corporations that have funded ALEC for 40 years have actually taken a tax credit. Okay? This is free and on the house. All right? Well, Common Cause about 2 months ago filed under the IRS Whistleblower Protection Act, challenging ALEC's tax status and essentially accusing them of 40 years of tax fraud. And just 30 more seconds. In filing this lawsuit, we provided over 4,700 pages of ALEC internal documents. They represent the minutes, the agendas, the motions, a hydrofracking bill stamped ExxonMobil. When we do this later, I'm going to put something up here and I'm going to show you where you can find all these bills. All right? Because if you are a powerful corporation and you want to get into a pay-to-play system, if you're the private prison industry and you want to make money and fill those jails, you join ALEC. You find Senator Russell Pierce, the task force chair and Senate president of Arizona, and you write the Arizona anti-immigration bill, Arizona SB 1070. That's not about immigration. That's about locking up people of color for profit. And as you work your way through this agenda on its war on public education, on the environment, you will find this common thread. So with that, I know that I'm over. Please learn more about this group. Learn who your Virginia delegates are. Hold them accountable. And then next January, when you go into your state houses, make sure you hold up these ALEC bills and call them what they are. Thank you.
All right, why don't we go ahead and go? First question.
Yes, Stephen Spitz is my name, Falls Church, Virginia, and this is real hardball, but Doug, what are the resources you're talking about?
All right. Carolyn, if you could, I'm sorry. Carolyn, would you do me a favor? Carolyn's in the back and she actually give her a big hand. Actually, what I'm going to start with here.
Turn it off.
You hear me okay? I got a lot of voice in the channel. If we could click on the ALEC one, although, creating the common cause here. This is part of the Common Cause website. This is actually our attorney, Eric Javier. Eric actually represents one of the most premier law firms in the country on whistleblower stuff. They've actually recovered over $12 billion on behalf of the American taxpayer. They worked for Phillips & Cohen. They actually, when they heard about when we showed them the documents we had, they took this case pro bono. Okay. They get about 200 cases a year. They take 2. They took this one in like the first hour and a half. So it should be a pretty cut and dry case. If you go to the Common Cause website and you work your way through this, as you go down this page, you'll find some links. And one of those links, Carolyn will take us to the next page even. You'll get to the actual task force data that we provided to the IRS, and you can work your way through it. Sorry, I haven't really quite worked out some of the, we tried to work this out earlier here. The other one, Carolyn, and maybe we can back out of this, is actually, here, go to the bottom one, please. You can familiarize, this is actually what we provided. We, through a whole bunch of FOIA requests, came up with over 60,000 pages of internal documents. This represents 2,700, and you can familiarize yourself with them. So Common Cause has a great website to educate yourself about ALEC and provide information. The other great website we're going to back out, Carolyn, is the Center for Media and Democracy, ALEC Exposed. The ALECexposed.org website, when you click on this, this is a very, very powerful tool and a very, very powerful resource. If you go down, there's a complete listing here of every single one of your Virginia delegates. So if you scroll all the way down, we're going to get to Virginia here. We're going to use a quick second. We're going to go to Virginia. Scroll right down. You got a lot of them. Okay? You want to know what's wrong with the Virginia legislature? Take a look at that. Because there's a lot of them here. And then, so what you need to do is eventually be able to back up and match up the ALEC model bills to these ALEC legislators. And then it's your job to take that to the press. It's your job to testify in committee and point these connections out. But this resource is here. And it's for everyone to use.
So what do you think is the best thing that we all can do? We seem to be satisfactorily offended by this whole process. Down the line, anyone who wants to take this, what can we do in Virginia? Anyone else outside Virginia? What can you do? Do you call your legislator? Do you write them a letter? What is the best way to do it? Anyone who wants that, multiple people, please take it.
Absolutely, call your legislator, write your legislator, ask them what they're doing with taxpayer dollars, where they're getting the bills that they're introducing. We have a campaign up on our website at the moment at RSPA that is getting your help to ask these legislators if they're members of ALEC, and if they are, to ask them to quit. Because you're the voices that they need to be listening to, that they're not paying attention to at the moment, and they need to know that there are citizens out there to counter the corporations that are making this so easy.
Anyone else?
Certainly that's number one. Raise your voice. Make sure you vote. Make sure you ask questions. And make sure you tell 5 other people about ALEC. I mean, this is the answer to organized money is organized people. Period. Period. And the only way that we can begin to dismantle the grip of ALEC and ALEC legislators and the corporations who fund them is if we, the people, actually spread this word and get word out to our friends, our colleagues, our family members, and don't just limit it to Virginia. This is happening all across the country. So when you're at family gatherings, at Thanksgiving or holiday celebrations, etc., talk to your family members. You might not think it's a perfect conversation. It is, because the fate of, I'm not kidding you, the fate of our democracy is at stake. I really don't believe that's hyperbole. I think that's the truth, because they are buying the government they want, not the government that we elect.
One thing that quickly I'll say that I've seen that kind of resonates in various states is that a lot of the legislation that's introduced and passed didn't even come from the state. The corporations don't exist in their state. The model bill came from some other state. So when you kind of push back and call that fact out, like, oh, you want to copy what Arizona did? Did you see what happened in Arizona? after they pass that bill. I mean, I think making those connections are very important too, to know that this is not a homegrown piece of legislation. The ideas that came out of the state legislature, it came out of citizens or corporations actually from other parts of the country.
Sir. My name is Kevin Perry. I've enjoyed the session, and we've been talking about a lot of defense in terms of fighting ALECs. So I want to offer an offensive suggestion. Right here in the Business Week, right here in the Business Week is a story about Allison Boston, who is Arlingtonian, and she's 20-something. She graduated from the University of Vermont. She interned with the congressman, worked in national parks, and she can't find a job. Now, I've been to several places. I've been down to the Pearson station, where outside of Wall Street is working, and they call the unions dodgy and old-fashioned. I had to go down there myself and ask them that question. I'm sure enough, that's what they do. My suggestion is we need to start talking about restructuring the economy. 30-hour work week, 3 10-hour days, time and a half after 30, double time after 40. I've got a postal worker that delivers my mail. He works 48 hours a week. Is that telling you that they're hiring more people? No, they're just putting those people to work. They should only be working 40 hours a week, not 48. Same thing that happened. The thing about it, there's work share that unions support, but that is only a defensive move. That's not for creating jobs. 30-hour work week would create 25% more jobs. And it's time that we do something for the 20-something year old.
Okay, thank you very much for that.
Howard Marlin from Herndon. First of all, I want to thank Senator Classen. I want you to know he has less than 3 weeks already. It's good to see some of you again. I saw you at Edwards Nation a few weeks ago and talking about the same subject, and I'm actually going to ask the same question. I'm very glad to hear you're playing hardball with ALEC on the corporate tax situation. My question at Edwards was, we know that these legislators and their families are being sent on these junkets, I think you call it a scholarship. And the question is, I kind of doubt that they're claiming that as a benefit and paying taxes on it. Can we play hardball and see if we can do something in that respect? I'm not a lawyer, but
We can. There are 2 parts of this about playing offense with ALEC. On the federal level was the IRS versus a lawsuit. Common Cause is also filed in 45 states with states' attorneys general, asking them to investigate ALEC and its activities in that state. Along with the Center for Media and Democracy is challenging this scholarship apparatus, because to many of us it looks not just like a junket, but a real ethical lobbying disclosure issue. I mean, I think it was last year in August at their annual meeting, they spent something like, what was it, $500,000 on childcare, right? So there's a real issue here, and what we need to do is work with our states and our state activists to find some of these real specific examples. Many of these ethics complaints have to be specifically complaint-driven, so we've got to come up with a few more specific examples. But what you're talking about, yes, there is a legal front that we are opening up on ALEC, and hopefully that will, again, work to shut these guys down.
Thank you. John Lovis from Reston, Virginia. Thank you guys for having this session. I must say, a lot of it sounded like we're just beginning to educate ourselves on this. I'm thankful for hearing these others start suggesting we go on the offensive, because you're not there yet. I wonder about Democrats. I presume that Democrats in general are not signing up to be members. I didn't see any of them on that list, but I bet that a lot of them are sympathizing, and there's a parallel here. The corporate money and the ALEC stuff, I assume, travels hand in hand. Here's your piece of legislation. There's $10,000, a campaign contribution that goes with it. And I look at Virginia looks like a real winner in this list of 5 corporates. I see Altria, and Mark Warner is one of their favorite people in the world. They give him a lot of money. And Dominion Power, man, they own a lot of Democratic legislators as well as Republican legislators, folks. We need to lean on our legislators about those contacts, those corporations they're taking money from. ALEC, yeah, we can go with that too, but go for the money, but go for the people who are running ALEC through our legislators, and we know their names, don't we? Thank you.
There's some recurring things about proactive agenda around ALEC, and I actually agree that there needs to be a proactive agenda. We've had organizations that have existed to be proactive versions, organizations that help us move legislation that actually works for people. I used to work for the Center for Policy Alternatives, which was a state legislative organization, but there's also the Progressive States Network, which is an organization that does public policy for state legislators. But also, many of the organizations here, I know labor in a lot of states has a proactive agenda. And so what we need to do is also work with our state-based organizations that do have proactive, jobs first agendas that are actually going to help working people in this country. People for the American Way, we have a Young Elected Officials Network, and part of our Young Elected Officials Network, we're developing policy tools for them so they can actually have a proactive agenda going on. So we're not just pushing back against the bad stuff that ALEC has done, but what we're saying is we want to have folks have more access to the polls. So there's a positive piece of legislation that those legislators can work with on the city, state, and federal level to move that forward. So there's a lot of organizations that are doing it. So really we need as a public to kind of plug into that and kind of champion those platforms for us.
Sure.
I was just going to add in, I mean, I do think that part of the ALEC pushback is putting them on the defensive about why are they wasting time on these defensive, divisive, partisan fights instead of focusing on jobs in the economy. We're in crisis. We need to be putting people back to work. We need to be stopping the shipping of our jobs offshore. We need to be supporting products that are made here in America. And these are all very popular populist issues that pull off of the charts. And we need to be rallying more behind these issues and using them to put the right-wing and the ALEC types back on their heels.
I can just add to that. I think underneath this is the question of whether progressives are willing to start making the case for government, making the case for regulation, making the case that we need revenues. And I do think you've seen a change in the discourse. I don't think it came from the Democratic Party. I think it came from people power movements in Wisconsin and Ohio and Occupy movements that got the conversation and that's resonated. And now we're talking about not how small do you want the government to be, but how fair you want the economy to be. One other example on the regulation front, when Scott Brown up in Massachusetts came out basically said to get rid of the EPA, he went up with ads talking about asthma and public health and saying there's a reason that we want clean air and clean water, and his negatives went up 17 points in about 10 days. So we have to remember that there's a reason people have liked clean air and clean water over the years, and the regulation is part of that. And so I think that level of offense as well, not just on the tactical side, but a willingness to say this is about protecting people, about public health.
Hi, CJ Saramala, I'm a reporter for the Washington Free Media in Washington, D.C. Since we were talking about sunlight and transparency, directors for Progress VA and I was wondering, do you disclose your sources of funding? And if so, can you tell me who they are?
No, I'm not going to.
Hi, CJ. It's nice to meet you in person. We've actually had this conversation before. And as I told you before, as a C4 organization, our donors aren't publicly disclosed. Our funds come from a mix of individuals who support our work and grants funds. We don't disclose the names because that's what our donors understand when they give us money.
Let me ask you a question, get this in. The supporters of ALEC say, there's the National Conference of State Legislators where all legislators go to, and they get lobbied, they talk about different issues, and they bring back model legislation introduced across the country. There's also Chamber of Commerce. We've got people here on the panel from unions and from education. Y'all guys put legislation together. How is this any different than the Chamber of Commerce or the National Commerce and State Legislature, what ALEC is doing, that what we're talking about today? What is the distinction?
Well, I'm going to tell you one thing, because I used to work for, like I said, the organization called the Center for Policy Alternatives. I was up there for about 15 years, or 10 years. And we were pretty much the counter to ALEC on the progressive side at that point. All of the model legislation that we developed, working with organizations that were connected to the active public, all that model legislation was online, made public, so anybody in the world could see that. Any legislator, no matter where you were from, could go online, an organization, anybody that was against you could go online and find that information. When you deal with ALEC, all this stuff is done in secret. Nobody knew this stuff was happening until that website came out, except for those of us that were just working behind the scenes, had legislators that snuck into their conference and came back and told us, hey, guess what, this is what they're doing. None of that stuff is public. All that stuff is gated away from everybody from public conversation. And when you look at the organizations that participate, they represent people. They're not representing false, artificial entities like the corporations that exist across the country.
It's about transparency, right? So everybody's got a right to draft a model bill, right? People do it all the time. When you work in the state legislature and you draft a model bill, let's say I'm a lobbyist and I've got a client and I've got a bill, right? I have to disclose. I'm a registered lobbyist. I file monthly reports. I have to file how much resources and time I put into not only lobbying legislators, but what I did in research and development of LD 1584, right? It's logged on the main state on the Ethics Commission's website. So there's a whole process. It's about public transparency, so people can see who's really behind the bill, right? ALEC is different. It had been, and probably still is, now. It's different, right? So even at NCLS, there's Republicans and Democrats, and there's even some corporate interests that sponsor NCLS, but the work's done in the light of day, right? People can see it. They can hold it accountable. They know what interest is behind it. That type of transparency doesn't exist with this. And so John, as Diallo said, this is being done in gated communities. You can't walk in as a journalist into the Scottsdale Hotel Resort, gated resort, walk in and say, I'd like to sit down on the energy task force with ALEC and watch what's going on here today. Indeed, some reporters were literally physically grabbed by private security and shoved out the door at the hotel in New Orleans, Louisiana. That's the yes, ma'am.
You're a case in Arlington. Actually, it's such good news to hear that there is a tax challenge through ALEC. After all, it was good enough to get about phone. And you have any response from any of these entities which we are challenging? Have any attorneys offered their pro bono services?
Yes, and thanks. I don't mean to take a vote of the panelists here. The law firm of Phillips & Cohen, Eric Hobby, and he's one of the brightest attorneys in this country, has taken this case and taken it for free. And even this week, on behalf of some faith-based groups out of Ohio, the former IRS attorney who headed this department in the IRS actually filed a very similar suit against ALEC and accusing him of tax fraud. That was a pretty, when I saw that one come through, that was another one. He's an attorney. He used to work for the same division in the IRS that's actually responsible for looking at, so he filed as well, right? And so the thing about it is, it's a private interest, right? They're gaining a private interest from this association. It is these bills that generate then profit for the corporation behind it. That's the key piece to this.
Support is music to my ears. Hi, this is all like brand new to me. So it's led me to wonder, one of my biggest concerns as a healthcare provider
health care, and particularly for Medicare-eligible people. And since 1977, when I first learned of this provision in the Medicare law, I have written to congressmen, I've written to senators, I've even written to President Obama, even when I was campaigning for him, the first time I ever got politically active, for an answer. And I am wondering if ALEC is behind the secrecy of the fact that physician training in this country and the tax-exempt salaries they receive as residents is funded with Medicare dollars. It's approximately, I'm estimating now, it's approximately $25 billion a year. In 1997, it was $6.7 billion. In 2006, the Institute of Medicine revealed that it had tripled to $18.6 billion. So I'm thinking at that rate, in the cost of health care, physicians, when they graduate and they go into residency, they receive a salary, which is from the Medicare money that is given to teaching hospitals. If you round it off to the next highest amount, it's approximately $50,000 first year, $51,000 the second year, and $52,000 the third year of their training. This is tax exempt from IRA paying any income taxes. And I do not begrudge this because we do need their expertise and their training. But I do have a problem that they then go out into private practice and refuse to accept new Medicare patients because reimbursement is too low. Well, $25 billion would go a long way to increasing that reimbursement so that people who need to have quality providers caring for them would be able to financially and fiscally for their practice survival afford to take Medicare patients.
What's the question?
The question is, since I can't get an answer from any legislator about why are you not at least letting me know that you know about this, and you're not letting your constituents know about it, and nobody's talking about it, I can't help but wonder if professional medical organizations and legislators, is ALEC behind this? I mean, I don't understand why it's such a secret.
I mean, I'll be happy to respond to it. Hospitals traditionally lose money on what's called graduate medical education that they receive to train new physicians, and they usually lose money per physician. That GME money that comes in does not even make up for it, but they're able to compensate for other things. So I don't believe it is a valid piece of legislation, but there is efforts to try to increase that amount, to get more physicians, to train more physicians, particularly in this world of the Affordable Care Act, to try to help more people.
But then, if it's...
Use the microphone. Get real close. Get real close.
Just move it closer. Just move it closer to you.
My name is Josephine Walsh, from Virginia, and I'm originally from Liberia, West Africa. This is my first time hearing about that, and I'm just blown away. I worked for an airline for 20 years, and because of the union, I had to take early retirement. And what they were doing, they were trying to make up stories on employees so that employees would get fired and would get benefits. And the best way that I was able to get around that was to take early retirement because I needed my health benefits because I was going through insurance. And in the meantime, I started to go back to school. And I went back to school, did 2 master's degrees, got out of school, And I am not qualified for the position that, or for the degree that I have in assessment. Question to you is that, is there any way for you all to advocate that institution include internship for people that get out of school and for organization to get incentive to provide internship for people that come out of school? Because the economy now, there's a lot of people out there with degrees, they can't get jobs because they don't have experience in a position, but they still don't have enough people to work. There are a lot of people out there to work, so is there anything you all can do?
Poverty rates is not one easily solved. I can tell you that I have seen an increase in the philanthropic community support for internship types of opportunities for workers and unemployed workers, etc. I think the best answer, and I know this isn't one that has a lot of immediate help and gratification, but the fact that you're here tonight speaks volumes about the willingness to be educated about what is really going on, and that begins to beget the solution, right? So the more people that know about how to raise their voice and become active in our democratic process to demand solutions from lawmakers that really address real people's concerns, that's step number one. It's not immediate, doesn't help in the short term, but in the long term, again, the only answer to organized corporate greed in this country is organized people.
This is an indirect answer to your question because it really kind of brings home the points that Naomi made earlier about what our state legislators are focusing on. And so the conversation around ALEC is that state legislators are focusing in on corporate profit, right? Because they're working through ALEC, they're focusing in on corporate profit. What we want to do is shift that conversation, like Naomi said, and listen, I mean, the biggest issues are the jobs in the economy right now. And we want our legislators to be working on having solutions for the issues that we're facing around jobs in the economy. So the pressure that we put on as a public needs to be focused in on that. We need to target ALEC, we need to hit ALEC, but we need to hit them in the context of we're in a rough economy right now. We need our elected officials to be working for us and protecting our jobs and fighting to correct the economy both on the federal and the state level. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Jacqueline Anti-ALEC, and my first question has to do with resources to people, average people, in order to empower them to be able to make decisions in their buying. Recently, I was the logistics coordinator for the Unite Women rally in Washington, D.C. that happened in April on the Senate park grounds. And we had a handout that we gave to people regarding how they can make decisions on a very basic level when they go to the grocery store or to whatever store they're going to buy something with. And then we provided them with alternatives. These people are, these products. I mean, you may not know that Anheuser-Busch makes 37 beers. And so having that knowledge empowers people to be able to make a decision right there at the point where somebody affects their bottom line. And so the question that I have is, I took a lot of time to try to create this alternative list for people to hand out at our rally. And I was wondering about the resources, whether or not there's going to be any plan to continue to update these resources so that grassroots groups, there's another rally that is going to happen again on August 18th in front of the Capitol, the We Are Women rally. It's a national rally, and I want to be able to provide a national rally with that information so that I can empower them when they go home to make decisions.
There's
respond to that?
Yeah, sure. Both on the Common Cause and the CMD-ALEC Exposed website, we've actually listed all of the corporations that were known as of July last year. And if you look at some of the efforts, because these corporations are very, very brand sensitive, right? So when you get one of them, like Procter & Gamble decided, well, I think that helped Johnson & Johnson make this decision, right? Because there's a clear choice that you can make, right? McDonald's, Wendy's, left, right? So there are things that people can do. You know, State Farm, really like a good neighbor? Where were you when some of this stuff was going through, right?
But
Well,
they don't have
asked what did
alternatives.
Brown do for you? Well, they could stand up and say no.
Well, no, it's a matter of somebody, the average person, having that information at their hand on a little, cheat sheet or whatever.
On both of those websites, you can access the list of the corporations, alecexposed.org or Common Cause. You'll see a full list of them.
Yeah.
And if you do business or if you are State Farm, right, you have a State Farm insurance card, right? Say what you're doing.
The second question is, does ALEC own climate control?
We have 10 more minutes and we have to get some more questions in.
I would actually, this is one, just to put this in perspective, I'm sorry for just the climate thing. So we were down in New Orleans, Louisiana last year, right? And there was an actual plenary being offered for state legislatures. And it was entitled this, Warming Up. Right? You know where I'm going. Right? Warming up to climate change. The many benefits of increased atmospheric CO2. For real. For real. So one of their bills is to cut the EPA's ability to eliminate greenhouse gases. Does that sound familiar? Because there's also 80-some ALEC alumni in the U.S. Congress.
I'm Vivian Callan, and I live in Arlington. I'm old enough to remember the glory days of American liberalism in the Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and Johnson years. Clinton was okay too. But I have been consistently impressed by the tectonic shift in our politics. The Washington Post once had a conservative, and now has more conservatives on the op-ed pages. And part of this, we're losing the battle of labels. When we call people conservatives, who are right-wing radicals, who are, they're the worst kind of regressive reactionaries. We give them the respectability of a label like conservative. We lose half the battle there. I think it's important for us not to pull in our horns, but to call these people what they really are.
Paul Friedman from Alexandria, Virginia, with the Vote Kids Action Fund. You can find us at votekids.org. We're working to help Tim Kaine get elected to the Senate. I have a simple question. First, I want to thank Sandra. Great job. I want to thank all the panelists. And I want to know, do you have any specific legislation yourself that any of your groups are promoting to deal with this problem, and or any boycotting plans for corporations that don't respond to our desire to see them move off ALEC and not get involved in this in the future?
Color of Change, the Good Color of Change's website, they've really been leading a national accountability campaign on these corporations and talking with them kind of directly first, saying, hey, look, what's your company doing supporting things like voter ID, which is a voter suppression campaign, Arizona SB 1070, Stand Your Ground legislation, right? That all came up with one single legislation, right? So you go there, I know that they are working their way through this corporate list and talking to them and raising this accountability. I think there's even some radio ads that we've ever heard. There's, I think, one on it they used in New Jersey with Johnson & Johnson. I know they're soliciting money from just activists and people, grassroots folks in general, in support of this effort. So Color of Change has been a real important, I think, voice in this, and certainly representing communities of color that are very sometimes negatively impacted by certain parts of the celebration.
certainly at NEA have lots of model legislation that we drafted given to our state affiliates. The VEA is our state affiliate here in Virginia. They have lots of proposals that they put forth every year to the General Assembly. But at the federal level, if you go to NEA.org/LAC, which is short for Legislative Action Center, there's a ton of both federal bills that we support, as well as our own legislative specs that we've offered to Congress. They're out for everybody to see.
And we at Congress Virginia have started conversations with some allied legislators and are working towards introducing a bill in the General Assembly this upcoming January that would increase disclosure over ALEC activities and the legislation that they're sponsoring.
Closely related is the overall issue of campaign finance reform. Until we get money out of politics the way it's happening, the corporations are going to continue to have disproportionate influence. And there are a number of organizations, including some here, who are taking different approaches, from the corporations are not people efforts to public financing to limitations on giving and other things. And this gets complicated. Tribbitt's here, and he's done a lot of work on this. In some cases, one of the other ways that they actually will contribute is they will literally hire people for their day jobs with either directly with ALEC or with ALEC-affiliated groups. So they're on the payroll, effectively, in these cases. So I think we can also look at conflict of interest laws and other things and how insidious this is in building the support network. But again, until we deal with campaign finance, there's both a state component and a federal component of that. I think we're going to continue to see the people's side of democracy to disappear.
Just as a quick follow-up, corporate disclosure laws, are there any laws that you're proposing to require corporations that donate to these kind of organizations that they must disclose their donations immediately or public on the web? What techniques are being used there, or are they blocked by the Supreme Court?
A number of proposals that have surfaced in Congress, the Disclose Act being the main one that has been pending in various permutations over the last several years. Pelosi tried to get it through, couldn't. Frankly, was blocked pretty much by the NRA, frankly. But that is the name of the piece of legislation, Disclose, at the federal level, that has the most traction and the most viability in terms of passing.
And this is a good time to say for the...
And it's active right now.
For the Virginia Progressive Caucus, we have flyers out there. You can be a member of the Virginia Progressive Caucus and help us with this legislation, help us break down some of this stuff. You can sign up. You take this on your way out. It's on the tables. You can sign up and do it online. It's really easy and we need your help. You may.
I'm Mary Lee McIntyre from Plain, Virginia. And I hope all of you are working also, even though it has not been mentioned tonight, about combating the war on women. As you know, through stealth, has penetrated every single state legislature to limit women's access to health care, including abortion, but not exclusively for that. So I hope you all have this foremost in your mind. I think we're also working not only for jobs, but the quality of the life we've grown to appreciate and have worked so hard for. And to deny women access to decent health care, I think is atrocious if not treasonable. So I hope you all are considering that. The alternatives are just going to be a higher maternity death rate. So that's the stark situation we are looking at. So please, I hope you all have a strategy in place that we can implement and quickly.
I will say, if you go on www.pfaw.org, one of our publications, one of our recent publications, is about the war on women, and it really makes the connection between a lot of the figures that are out there that are spewing some of this venomous information out there around women, and the attack on women, and it really connects the dots. And ALEC is not explicitly listed under that, but you can see many of those players and players that play that are connected to many of these types of institutions and where this information is actually coming from. So we have a report. It's the People for the American Way website is www.pfaw.org, and there's a report that we recently done about the war on women.
along the same lines, I have a question. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious, you can sort of connect the dots, why this is a corporate-driven organization like ALEC would want, say, to have model legislation for fracking or for uranium mining in Southern Virginia, etc. But I was wondering if we could talk about an issue that's also an issue about model legislation around the country. We're certainly seeing it here in Virginia, and that's voter suppression. Because one of the things that we're seeing is that at the same time we have this massive influx of money and secret money into our election system, we also have a concerted effort to prevent people from voting. The bill that became law on July 1st is a bill that will prevent arguably thousands, possibly tens of thousands of Virginians, mostly minorities, elderly students, from voting. And that's the kind of language that we've seen in other states as well. And could you tie that together perhaps?
Yeah, I would just say it's certainly a deliberate strategy on the part of the right wing. After the 2008 election, we've seen about 35 different states introduce legislation to suppress people's votes, whether it's voter ID or, one of the things the states have been doing in the past several years is trying to expand the time in which people could vote. So if you're somebody that's working 2 jobs and you can't get to the polls between 7 in the morning and 7 at night because you're working 2 jobs, a lot of the states were expanding the length of time. Like other countries, you can vote on Sundays because it's easier than doing it during your workday. And a lot of states were expanding that time, making absentee voting or vote by mail more accessible. And since the 2008 election, as part of a deliberate strategy, when they saw the large numbers of people of color, African Americans, Latinos, young people coming out to vote in that election, they knew that, to advance their political agenda, that they're going to have to put the kibosh on that. And so you see, in a state like New Hampshire, where they introduced a voter ID law, and one of the legislators got up on the floor in New Hampshire and said, we've got to prevent these students from voting because they're all voting Democratic, and we need to make sure that they can't vote, where they're going to school. I mean, it's a very, very, there's no pretense about it. And so I think we all need to be clear about what their motives are. One of the things for the AFL-CIO that we're doing is trying to make sure we have a website, My Vote, My Rights, that documents for each state what the changes have been in the voting laws, and trying to educate people so they know what they need to take when they go to the polls, they know what their rights are when they go to the polls. So we've got a lot of education of voters to do going into the 2012 elections because so many of these changes have gone through. So we need to keep that piece of work in mind and be really fighting for voters' rights.
Yeah, just if you had any doubt about the voter ID bill and is this an ALEC bill or not, the voter ID bill in the ALEC portfolio was one of the earliest ones that was moved in. You can go, if you understand ALEC, they were founded by a man named Paul Weiser, who is a conservative luminary, a movement builder for the conservative movement, along with Henry Hyde, Congressman Hyde. But if you go to the YouTube machine, and you type in Paul Weiser, W-Y-R-I-C-H, and you hit ALEC, or you hit and it will come up with a YouTube video from, I believe, the late 1970s, of him giving an address to a Christian evangelical group. And he says, you know what our problem is? It's kind of worked up at this point. He says our problem, when he's talking to the audience of Christian evangelicals, he says, we suffer from a goo-goo problem. Good government. Because on the same, there's people that believe that everybody should vote. He then says he's not one of them. And that when fewer people vote, our side does better. Okay? It's pretty stark. And that voter ID bill has been in that library for a very, very long time. But in the 2010 midterms, we saw a whole landscape change across this country. And we started to see these bills move 8, 10 states all at once. Now some states, even under Republican control, like the state of Maine, pushed back and actually voted their voter ID bill down. But this agenda really should, if you're a Republican, if you're a conservative, if you're even a Tea Party,
the corporate control of this that I think should concern people across the entire country. And everybody should have a right to vote, right? There's no voter fraud. If you look at it, it was 0.00004, right? It really doesn't exist. Now, there's deceptive practices and all sorts of other things we should pay attention to. But voter ID probably is, they used to say, right, a solution looking for a problem. There was no problem.
I mean, just to echo that very quickly, it's important that we understand that this is a response to voter success, not to voter fraud. The problem was that all the things that we have been working for to make it easier for every citizen to vote were working. Having more days, more times, people working 2 shifts, everything Naomi was talking about, more people were voting, and it scared the hell out of these guys. And so we need to understand this is a response to voter success and not to voter fraud. We need to not only play defense but play offense. This is one of those places we need to get back to those efforts to make sure that we guarantee every American's right to vote. And also to understand with these corporations, it wasn't enough to just be able to hand over a bill that gave them a return on investment. This is about locking in political power. And on the smoking gun side of things, there was an official in Pennsylvania who essentially bragged that they're trying to put Pennsylvania back in play for Romney through this voter suppression effort. So this is very real stuff, and we need to keep an eye on it and fight.
My name is Kavita Terry. I led
Microphone.
My name is Kavita Terry. I'm originally from Chicago. I now live in Washington, D.C. I led the United Against the War on Women early in D.C. I'm now working with We Are Women March in D.C. One of the things when I walked in here I noticed, and that is, these are all my baby booming colleagues. I was the class before when I was born, so I came in on the end. And what I do see missing, because unfortunately I relate more to that generation below me. And what I see missing, I love these types of forums. What I see missing are those people. And those are the people who now have the huge purchasing power. DC being one of the highest paid cities paid for wages for new graduating students. Those are people who are going to be making decisions really soon. And they're voting, and they have huge purchasing power, as I said. How do we reach those people, make those people interested in these types of forums, and besides beer, wine, and pizza? Bring them in to seriously begin to understand and conversate and get in the mix, and not just their moms, their dads, their aunts, their uncles, and grandmas. Like, how do we reach those people? How do you all reach those people?
I mean, I will say that there are a lot of young people that are involved in this conversation. Like I mentioned before, we have a program as part of the People for the American Way called the Young Elected Officials Network. All those young elected officials are 35 representing cities, states, and some even on the federal level. And so we work with them on a regular basis to educate them and to have them actually be advocates within their state legislatures on these issues, and having them be advocates on their city councils. Helping them, because they're new to this process as well. So they're trying to learn that as well. We also have a program called Young People For, which is our college student division, which we continue to push this information to as well, but also have them be a part of the voices that resonate. And as issues that particularly impact young people come up, we want to elevate those voices and help them to understand who the players and the powers that be that are implementing these pieces of public policy and actually elevate their voices. So young people are becoming a part of these voices, these conversations, probably in different forms. But I think you're correct. We need to continue to spread this out. Still have conversations with college students, with our neighbors, with other folks that are not in this room. I mean, I think that's where these types of forums are helpful, because once we get information, it's our responsibility to share the information that we get with others. And as we start to see gaps in people that participate in this room, I think it's our responsibility. Also, I always push back on audiences. It's our responsibility, not just panelists, not just the folks that set up this meeting, to go back to your own communities and make sure that you're touching the folks that are left out, that are not been a part of this conversation, and bring them in. And also find out from them what's helpful in order to receive this type of information.
I'm in the area of a very large
young contingent of prospective educators. We have a student member program. Everybody who's going through a teacher prep program or an college of education or any kind of educational training is eligible to become one of our members. We've got 70,000 student members across the country, and one of the secrets that those of us who are not in that generation have to begin to understand, and we're starting to do this better, I think, as a progressive community writ large, is the power of social media and reaching people. There's nothing like one-on-one organizing. That's the best way, face-to-face contacts, meetings, whether it's beer, wine, pizza, whatever, but there's no question that the power of social media, digital natives, we have to master that technique around organizing. Student members of NEA. Yep.
I was just going to say, the labor movement is facing this issue as well, and we're trying to do a lot of work, and have just launched a project in the last couple of years called the Young Worker Project, where we're really trying to reach in and tap into young workers as they enter the labor force. We define young workers as 18 to 35, so we have a pretty generous definition of young. But I think a lot of the economic issues, let me be clear, I'm past that definition. But I think, a lot of the economic issues that we've been talking about tonight resonate even more deeply with young people. All the statisticians and economists are saying that this cohort of young people could very well be the first generation that does less well than their parents do. And you see kids graduating from college moving back in with their parents because they can't find a job that it can sustain them, living on their own. And so I think we've got to make sure that we're focusing on that as a progressive movement and really reach out. And it is on us to really reach out and to get people involved around those issues. These are very bread and butter issues for young people who are coming out of school with enormous school debt. And then, if you can't find a job that pays more than the minimum wage for 3 to 4 years, that's going to completely impact your earnings power over the course of your lifetime. And we've got to be focusing more on those issues, and candidates and electeds need to be focusing more on those issues as